Back once again to this tutorial series on creating a simple CRUD app using Java and JavaScript frameworks. And in the past couple of tutorials, we completed the operation using Express.js, and also we were able to bootstrap the JavaScript web application using from this website, startspring.io, and we're able to test application, and we ran the application. It was all good. So in case you missed that part of the tutorial, you can just check the description and the link on where to get that, so you can catch up with what we were able to cover thus far. So now we want to move ahead and continue with every of the functionality and all the method we need to have on the Java part of the section. So we also have a file folder structure, our packages all in place, where we have the controller, the entity repository, and the services file. And now we'll go right in and create the model or the entity Java class for our database. So we'll create the file user entity.java. So just be creating a regular a class here that will contain every of the items which will be in our database column, and just like we will have it in our Express app, we need basically just three things from the user: the name, email, and the password. So let's create that private string name of the user. Let me just duplicate this one for the email, and then we'll have the last one for the password. So these are the items we'll need in our database table. Let's create a long field for the ID. Okay, so these are basically all what we need in our database table. And for Spring Boot to take this for Spring Boot to map this into our database table, we need to add the entity annotation tag on our class. So this will let Spring Boot know this is not just a Pojo, but this is Spring Bean. This is a Spring. This is an entity which we want to map to our database table. And then we need to, since these fields are private, we need to get a getter and a setter for them. And if you're on VS Code, once you just right click on your code editor, just go on source action, you'll see generate getters and setters, and then we can select on that and highlight every of the field which you will need a getter and setter for, so that will automatically generates the getters and setters for you. And we also need to generate a constructor for our class, because we'll be creating a type of this class whenever we want to get a type of the object. So once again on that, let's also create a toString method for that, and we need a toString method for all of the variable field. We'll need them later in our packages. Then we need to also get a getter and a setter for that. So we'll go to source action once again, generate constructor. So we need a parameterized constructor of all the item we have in there, so we can generate that. And we also need another constructor, which will be an empty constructor with no argument in it. So generate constructor and no argument, just go ahead and click on OK. And subsequently, I will show you how to use a Lombok package that will actually do this under the hood for you. You don't necessarily need to have all of this boiler code in your class file. So we'll also demo that shortly. So let's just have this. We'll now have our class properly set up, all the getters and the setters and a toString method. So that is all we need to do for our entity class. And the next line of action is for us to work on the repository class. And then the repository class is where we'll create an interface in this part, and then we will kind of map it with we'll extend the repository, the JPA repository method that will kind of provide us with some of the predefined method which the class already have or provide us, and then all of the queries and all of the create, the save, and define, and every one of that from the JPA package. So that we can also go ahead and work with that. So let's create an interface here, and I'll call it user repository dot java. So that's the file we're creating, and we're not creating a class, we're creating an interface. So select interface here, and then this interface will extend the JPA repository. This should extend this JPA repository, this very one here. And then this JPA repository, we need to pass in a type, and we're passing in it's accepting two type. We want to pass in a user entity. We want to pass in a user entity, and then what we want to use as the ID to our user entity is a type of long. And now back to our user entity. So since this is what we want to have within field, within our variables, within on our column, we need to also map these to we need to give this an ID tag. So JPA will know this is the variable which we want to use as a primary key, and then also need to tell it how we want this to be generated, and we want it to be auto-generated value, how this value will be. We're not going to be putting in our ID manually, so JPA should generate that for us, and we'll put in the tag at generated value. Okay, and then within open close bracket, as the strategy will be the generated type, we want to make it as an identity. So that is all what we need for that, and our repository is also in place, and that is basically all of the actions and all of the steps we need to be taking on our repository and our entity file. So the next thing we need to work on right now is the service, where we'll have every of the method, every of the action we need to do, communicating to our database, saving records, getting record, and deleting of the record. So we need to create a user service file here. So we'll call it user service dot java. This will also be a class file, and quickly we also need to put this with the annotation tag at service. We need to give it the tag at service, and that will be imported from the stereotype the service class. And I think I forget, we also need to map this with the tag at repository tag, so Spring Boot will know how to work with this file as well. So this is repository, and that is also coming from stereotype as well. Okay, now back to the service file. This is now working as a service class. So what are those methods we need to create? We need to create 4 methods. One is to create a user, and then the other method which we want to work on is to get all user. The third method we want to work on is get user by ID. The fourth one is to delete user by ID. And the other step is to update a user. We need to update the user by ID as well. So quickly let's create this method and all of that. So we need to import the repository interface we created there, and then that is which is also extending the JPA repository here, providing us some of those function that is already predefined within the ORM in order for us to communicate with our database. So let's just do that here, import it in a class file, and we'll call it is user repository. Yeah, that is imported, and let's just go ahead and call it user repository too, and so that is it. And then since we want Spring to, this is a Spring service repository, we need to add the @autowired tag as well. So we are not creating, we're not trying to create an instance of the package of the file which created. So Spring is handling that for us. So now the first method we want to create is to create a user. So let's create a public method there. The type we want to return a type of user entity. That is also imported. User entity, that is that I want to return. I want to call the function create user, and this is accepting an object of type user entity, and we can call that user record, or you can call it payload or anything you want to have it there. That's fine. And then so we want to we want to record this user information into our database. We want to save them, and we can just go ahead and call on the user repository dot, then user repository have some kind of method which is coming from the JPA class, which we extended here. So there's a save method there that the JPA repository offer us, and then this is taking in the payload we want to save, which we want to save into our database, and that is a user record which we're passing from the body here. So we just need to return that from our service method. So that is basically how you can save a record into your database using the JPA library. So that is all what you need to create a record into your database. Now the other one we want to work upon is the getting of all user record. So create the method public. So we'll be returning an arrays of user this time around for the get all. So that will be a list. That will be a list, and then that will be a list of user entity. We have that there, and then let's call the name of the function get all. I'll make it camel case all user, and then this method is actually not taking in any input parameter. So what we want to return is I want to return the user repository dot find all. We want to return the find all, this method right here, and that will return out the list of all users. So we just want to return this so our function, and that will return us all of the record within our database table. Type list is not a generic. I think the list we need is actually from Java .util. Not, this is the list we want to import, not from the package which was imported from. Okay, so that is for getting of all the record within your database. Just the user repository method, which we have which we're getting from the interface, and JPA repository, which we extended. This find all method return us from the database all of the available record within database. Now we need to create the next method of getting a user by ID. So we're just returning just one user this time around. So we're now returning an array. So we're returning just this method should return us just user entity, and we'll call it get user by ID. So for this method, we need to get the ID from the method will request an ID from the user, so we can get that record from we can get the record based on the ID being passed into the method. So we just want to return user repository dot find by. We use the find by ID method. Find by ID, this one we have right here, and then we pass in the ID which we want to get, which the function is receiving from the method. Now this is actually if there's a value there, which we assume we're not doing any kind of error check or management. So I will call on the .get method, which will return us the record of that very user from the items. So that is how we get a single user by ID, and then using the user repository find by ID method. So now for the deletes, if we want to delete a user by ID, so for this very method, we don't want to, we just want to return back a string or kind of a statement of user deleted successfully if that is the case. So the method will be public string and then delete user by ID, we'll call the function, and this will also take in an input parameter of the ID which we want to delete with, and then we search the user from a record based on the ID provided, and we'll go ahead to delete the record. So in order to delete the record of the user, we first of all need to do an if else condition to check if the user record is there in the database. So let's we'll just go ahead to say if user repository dot find by ID, none, or if we don't want to use find by ID, we can use exist by ID. So this will help us check if the record exists. Then we'll go ahead to do the action. But what we want to check here first is we want to check if the record does not exist. So if the record does not exist, then we just want to go ahead and return with a statement, with a string statement of user does not exist, and that is all what we want to return there. And what if the record exists? If this user is not there in the database, this method will just break out here from this return and we'll get a message of user does not exist. But if the user exists, then we can now go ahead and just call on the user repository dot find by ID, and then delete by ID method will delete that record for us, which is what we have here. Now if you check, you can see we're having some kind of IntelliSense here telling us of the kind of things we need to pass in. We need to pass in for the delete by ID, which you see here. We're having some kind of IntelliSense telling us we need to pass in a key of ID, and we're having some kind of long there because when we're setting up our repository interface, when we are extending it with the JPA repository, we pass in the kind of data type we want to be working with, and we can see we're saying the data type is of the type user entity, and then the key which we'll be working with is a long, and then that's why we're getting the IntelliSense which you see right here. So if the user is successfully deleted here, then we can just return a string response, user successfully deleted. And so that is basically it. That's all what you need to do to delete the user by ID. And lastly, let's create the update to user function, and this will return us a user entity of type user entity. Let's call it update user by ID. And so this method will take two variables. We need to pass in the objects we want to the new object want to persist in the database, and then the ID of the user we want to save that record on. So we need to pass in user entity type, let's call it a new user record and then we need to pass in an ID of type long, ID in that. So the first thing we need to do is we need to get the record first and then set the ID. We can go ahead and see user record or new user record dot set ID of the ID which we're passing in here, and then we're not doing some check to see if the record exists. And for now, we just want to save the user record in there. So we'll just go ahead and say create a variable of type user entity of updated record, and then we want to have that as that will be user repository. We want to use the save method, and we're saving in this new user record which we're now passing in for the update. I'm passing in that, and then all what we need to do right now is to just return updated record that's okay. We'll have the okay method, and then within there we can go ahead and then save the user record, and then so user entity here dot okay dot we want to save the updated record of the user, and then want to get the body. I'm gonna call the get body method for that, and this is response entity. Okay, so that is the update method. The delete method gets by ID, create, and every of the method which we need in our service file. So the last step we need to do right now is just go to our controller where we'll have the route, and we'll map them, and then we link them together with the associated service method. Go to the user controller file which we have here, which we created, and this is where we'll map each and every of the service to the right JavaScript, to the right Java method in our services. So for the create user method, which will be receiving a post request, we need to map that to at post mapping, and then we'll put in the name of the route to this very post request. So once the user go to just post users, and we want to call on this controller method, which is public. Want to return the type of user entity. Want to return this type of user entity, and then the name of the function is create user, and then this will be taken in some request body, which is some JSON format from the user, and that is what we will be passing to our service file to create the user. So we'll be receiving that via the request. We want to receive that from the request body, and what we're receiving is a user. It's an object of type user entity. We can call this payload, and that is good. That is all what we're receiving for the create record, and then we just want to return user service. Want to return user service, and we have that. We'll pass in the object to the create method. But before that, we need to create we need to import that into our controller file package, and we need to get user service class, and then what we want to have that as a user service. And then, so since this is a service class and it's not a regular Pojo, so we have to add this at auto wired annotation to it, so we can work with that as a Spring Bean. Okay, so we now, this is the user service we want to work with, so we want to call on user service, want to call on the create user method we should have in there, and we're passing in the payload. So that is all what we need to do for the create user endpoint. And then for the get all user, we can create a get request for that. We want to link that to a get mapping, since we'll be getting all the records using a get method. Want to call whenever they make a get request to users, then we want to call on this function public. We want to return a list of users, and then want to return a list of user of type user entity, and want to call the function get all records or get all user, and this function will basically not receive anything from the request body or from anywhere. So what we want to return here, want to return user service dot get all users, and that is all what we need to do in order to create the controller function to get all user from our database record. So now if we want to get let's quickly create one to get a user by ID. So that is still a get mapping, and then the path is, let's just call it users slash, then we need to pass the ID here. Now if you're from the JavaScript Express world, all what you need to do is to pass a colon here and then an ID, and then that will be fetched from the request parameters. But if you want to do it with Spring Boot, you need to pass the ID within your curly braces. You put in the ID here, and that is how you can get to receive it from your path variable. So this time around, we want to return the type of user entity as the function, this time of get one user, and then this is the body of the function. So for this method, we'll be receiving the ID from the path variable as one of the parameters which will be needed, and we'll return back the response of the record of the user based on the ID being passed. So we are getting the ID from that path variable, and we're getting a long ID. So because we're using ID here, you can just go ahead and pass in the ID this right here. But if you're using a different name here, let's say you want to use user ID here, then you need to pass the user ID within the curly braces here, user ID, just like what we have right there. But since we're using ID everywhere, then you don't need to put in the curly braces, or you don't need to map the ID directly here. So that will be mapped to the name which we have in here, since the name and what's coming from the path variable is the same thing. So just need to return user service dot get user by ID, and we pass in the ID variable which we are getting from our path variable, and that is basically it on how you can get a user by ID using the path variable ID being passed. Now the other one we need to work with is the delete user. So we need to map that to a delete mapping, and then the path for this is slash users. Then we need to pass in the ID as well, because we want to delete a user by ID. We're not deleting everything from our record. So we need to pass a public, a string. We just want to return back a string response this time around. Delete, let's just call it delete user, Same way with the get user by ID here, we need to get a user from the path variable. So passing at path variable there, I want to get an ID of type long. We need to pass in the ID right there, and then within a function body, want to return the response from user service dot delete user by ID. Now you can see how because of the strictly type of the language, you can see how we're getting some kind of intelligence for us, and you can see how this is kind of very fast and easy for you to work around with. So now lastly, for the delete, we want to map that to a method of patch mapping. We want to use the patch method to access that. So this time around, we also need to get that from users, and then we also need to pass the ID from the want to pass the ID as part of the parameters on our method. So the update method will return us the record of the user, the new updated record. So the method will be of type public user entity, and then we're receiving two things this time around. We're receiving the ID, and then we're receiving some record from the request body. So let's get the request body of type user entity, and that is we can call that the payload, which is receiving the new payload, which we want to save in our database. And then we need a path variable for us to grab the ID from the path variable, and so long and ID. Okay, so all what we need to do here, same thing, is just return user service dot update user. I think user service dot update user. Okay, update user by ID. Here we have it there, and then we need to pass in here the user entity first as the first payload. We need to pass in, and then the other thing we need to pass onto the payload is the ID. Okay, I think I made a typo here. I'm not putting in the name of the function, so let me call it update user. Okay, so yeah, that is all of the operation we need to do, all of the function we need to write, and every of the step we need to take. So we can go right ahead and test it. And this video is running pretty long. I will give it a pause here, and in the next video tutorial we'll just test every of our functions, every of our endpoint, and that is basically it and how it's supposed to go. So thank you very much for sticking around. See you in the next video section.